November 1944. 8:47 in the morning. Camp 186, a converted manor estate outside Harrogate, North Yorkshire. Frost clung to the hedgerows, and the air smelled of cold earth and wood smoke. The truck rolled to a stop like an old beast breathing its last breath. Its wheels crunched over frost-bitten gravel, breaking the silence with each turn. The engine coughed, stuttered, and fell quiet. Then came stillness. Not silence, but the kind of stillness that hangs over moorland and naked oaks when winter is near. A hush thick with breath, with waiting. Lena Hoffmann did not move at first. She sat inside the lorry's wooden frame, knees locked, wrists shackled together with field cuffs, metal biting cold into pale skin. She had not spoken since leaving Dover. She had not cried. Not since they stripped her insignia in France and burned her papers. Not since the woman next to her on the transport whispered prayers into the iron air, only to be pulled away at the station without explanation. Lena had been raised on silence, raised on orders and uniforms and the hum of radios clicking to life in the Signals Corps compound outside Saarbrücken. But this silence was something else. It was not discipline. It was fear, solid and ancient. Fear born of not knowing the rules anymore. The truck gate dropped with a wooden crack. Boots crunched gravel. A voice, low, not harsh, called her name in English, mispronounced it. She didn't answer. Then another voice. Different. Warmer. Rounder. Northern English, she would learn later. Miss, come down slow. Nobody's gonna hurt you. Miss. Not prisoner, not German, not animal. Just miss. She stepped down from the lorry like a deer unsure of the ice. Chains clinking against the metal rail, her breath rising white in the air. A tall man in a brown wool coat watched her from behind the fence. Another, in khaki, held a clipboard. The guard at her side wore a revolver, but his hand wasn't near it. Across the courtyard, the red brick manor loomed like a forgotten church, its windows covered in frost. Smoke rose from chimneys behind it. Somewhere, a kettle whistled. And the strangest thing, someone was whistling back. A tune, slow, bluesy, not military. As if someone had forgotten for a moment that this was a prisoner of war camp. Lena stared. The man with the cowboy hat stood by the side door of the manor, leaning on a broom. He had thick forearms, corduroy trousers tucked into well-worn boots, and a curved bone pipe hanging unlit from his lip. He looked like something out of a movie she'd once seen with her brother. American, maybe, or just a man too poor for buttons. She didn't know yet that he was from East Yorkshire, had worked cattle before the war, had volunteered not for the army, but for the Home Guard, called himself George. George looked at her, at the shackles on her wrists, the short length of chain between them, and shook his head once. Not angry, just sad. Then, with slow steps, he walked toward her. The guards didn't stop him. He stood before her, not speaking, just looking at her wrists. She couldn't look him in the eyes. When he finally spoke, it was so quiet, she thought she'd misheard. Too cold for iron, he said. Then he took off one glove, reached into his coat, and pulled out a small key. He held it in his palm for a moment, as if even he wasn't sure if it was the right thing. Then he stepped closer. She tensed, certain this was a trick. That kindness always came before pain. That the British had their own rules, cruel in different ways. But when his fingers touched the lock, they were warm. A click, one cuff fell open. Another click, the other fell. She didn't move, didn't understand. Her hands, free now, fell to her sides like they didn't belong to her anymore. The guards didn't shout. No one barked, no rifle was raised. Only George stepping back, tipping his hat once toward her like a ranch hand in an old dream, and muttering, "There, that's better, isn't it?" Lena looked down at her wrists. Red lines circled them like faded rings in a tree stump. The chains were gone. But something heavier still pressed on her chest. The confusion of mercy where she expected malice. No one had told her this could happen. No one had said the enemy might be human. George turned without another word, broom slung over his shoulder, and walked back toward the manor's side door. His boots made no sound on the frost. He never looked back. And in that moment, Lena Hoffmann felt something crack inside her. Not break, not shatter, just crack, like the surface of ice when the sun finds it. The manor wasn't cold. That surprised her first. Its long stone corridors were dim, but not bitter. A stove burned low in the kitchen, casting ribbons of orange light across a wooden floor that creaked with age. The air was filled with smells that didn't belong to war. Yeast, roasted onions, the faint memory of lavender. It reminded her of the baker's shop in Saarlouis. Before the radio stations, before all of it, a woman in an apron glanced up from a table dusted with flour. "Take her boots off," said one of the guards. Not cruel, just tired. Lena hesitated. She didn't understand. The woman stepped forward instead, squatting with quiet dignity, and unbuckled Lena's worn Wehrmacht boots. The leather peeled away stiffly, revealing thin socks damp with sweat. The woman wrinkled her nose, not unkindly, then stood. "Come," she said, her voice like worn linen. Yorkshire vowels softened with age. She led Lena past shelves lined with tins and onions strung like beads toward the back of the kitchen, through a narrow door and into a small washroom where a basin steamed gently in the window light. There it was, the bowl. Steam curled upward from the water's surface. A bar of soap, real soap, not powdered lime, rested beside it on a folded cloth. White, clean, soft. Lena stopped. She hadn't seen soap since Normandy. Her last bath had been in ditch water. The lice had burrowed behind her ears. She'd forgotten what clean even felt like. The old woman, without a word, placed a hand on Lena's shoulder. Not pushing, just resting. Then she left, pulling the door behind her. Lena stood alone. She stared at the bowl. She looked at her hands, raw, cracked, lines of grime darkening her palms like maps of another life. She didn't move for a long time. And then she did. She peeled off her uniform jacket, heavy with dirt and old blood. Her blouse stuck to her skin. She paused at the undershirt, hesitated, then pulled it over her head. Her ribs showed. She dipped her hands into the water. Warmth, real warmth. Not scalding, not tepid, just gentle. She gasped, not from pain, but from the shock of remembering what it felt like to be touched by something that didn't hurt. She picked up the soap. It smelled faintly of lye and rosemary. She ran it over her arms, her neck, the hollow beneath her collarbone. Filth peeled away in gray streaks. She didn't cry, but her breath hitched. Once, twice. She washed her face last, as if saving it. And when she looked into the cracked mirror above the basin, she saw a stranger, eyes sunken, hair stringy, a bruise at her jaw. But something else, too. Something so small it barely had shape. She wasn't just a prisoner. Not in that moment. She was Lena, just Lena. When she opened the door, the woman was waiting. She held out a towel, woolen, frayed at the edges, but warm from the kitchen. Lena took it with both hands. They didn't speak. Instead, the woman handed her a plain cotton dress. Civilian, gray, no buttons, no insignia, no rank. Lena looked at it as if it were a puzzle. The woman gave a nod. "We'll mend your uniform later. You'll want something dry till then?" Lena nodded slowly, folding the towel tight against her chest. The warmth of the wash water clung to her skin like memory. It wasn't kindness she feared. It was what kindness meant. If these people, the enemy, could offer soap and warmth without shouting, without mocking, then everything she had believed was crumbling. The Reich had told her what to expect. They had drilled it in. The English were monsters. They tortured. They starved. They violated every rule of war. That's what the leaflets had said. That's what the radio confirmed. But here, in this manor kitchen lit by coal and quiet, Lena stood barefoot on warm stone, drying her arms with a towel that still smelled faintly of old apples. And she was starting to question everything, even herself. She sat at a wooden bench, still half wrapped in the towel, while the old woman sliced a heel of brown bread and placed a chipped mug of tea in front of her. Lena blinked. She stared at the bread. No one else ate. No guards, no lectures, no questions. Just bread and tea. The tea was too sweet, the bread too soft. She chewed slowly, as if each bite might vanish if she wasn't careful. She didn't taste much, but the warmth filled the hollow in her chest, where fear had camped for weeks. From the kitchen window, she could see the camp's outer field stretching toward the foggy tree line. A pair of crows hopped near the barbed wire. Beyond it, sheep grazed like the war had never touched them. Somewhere deeper in the estate, a bell rang twice. Time was still measured here, not in shell bursts or retreat orders, but in meals, in chores, in something older than war. And through it all, Lena sat, quiet, holding the tea between both hands. Chains gone, skin clean, stomach settling, and for the first time since France, she was not afraid, just uncertain, like someone waking from a dream too long believed. Lena's first duty came the next morning, before the frost had lifted from the hedgerows. A guard, not unkind, not curious, handed her a canvas coat and pointed toward the back of the manor. "You'll be helping with the stove wood. Go on, he's waiting." She didn't know who he was, but when she stepped outside and saw the familiar slouch of the man with the broom, this time holding an axe and a bundle of kindling, she stopped short. George, the British cowboy. His coat was older than hers. Worn wax cotton patched with corduroy at the elbows. He didn't wear a helmet, just the same broad-brimmed hat from yesterday, weather-beaten and tilted back to reveal a lined face that looked like it had been carved from river stone. He glanced up, met her gaze, then tipped his head without a word. She stepped forward slowly. He handed her a bundle of sticks, rough and resin-scented, wrapped in twine. "Kindling for the kitchen stove," he said. "Chop the larger logs next. I'll show you how." No questions, no suspicion, no orders barked from behind. Just instructions, work, normalcy. They moved together to a chopping stump in the yard, where a row of split logs waited under a canvas tarp. Frost sparkled on the edges. Lena's breath came in short clouds. She rubbed her hands together. George held up the axe. "This side's heavier," he said, showing her the grip. "Let the weight do the work." He placed a small log upright and brought the axe down in a slow, arcing swing. The wood cracked with a clean snap. Not forceful, just inevitable. He handed her the axe. She hesitated. The Reich had never put tools in her hands. Only radios, codes, wires. Here, the axe weighed more than she expected. But it felt honest. She mimicked his stance, adjusted her grip, raised the blade, not high, and brought it down. The axe glanced off the side. The log didn't split. She flushed. George didn't laugh, didn't speak. He stepped beside her, nudged her foot back an inch, repositioned her left hand. "Now again," he said. This time, the blade struck clean. The log fell apart with a satisfying crack. Lena blinked. She split 3 more in silence. Each time, her muscles adjusted. Each time, George just watched. Pipe unlit between his teeth, nodding slightly. She could feel something shifting between them. Not friendship, not yet. But something deeper. A kind of shared space. The space that exists between people who agree, without speaking, not to hurt each other. He handed her a fresh bundle. That'll do. Let's get them in before the frost eats your fingers. Inside, the manor's back corridor smelled of peat smoke and coal dust. George led the way, his boots leaving soft prints in the hall's worn rug. The kitchen was quieter today. The old woman nodded once as Lena entered and took the bundle from her arms. "You'll stay on wood duty for now," George said. "Mornings, better than mucking out pigs." Lena didn't smile, but something near her eyes softened. She looked at her hands, red from the cold, splintered at the edges, but strong. The work wasn't punishment. It wasn't mockery. It was just work, and work had its own dignity. Later that day, during ration time, she saw George again in the courtyard. He was kneeling by the fence, feeding crusts to a one-eyed terrier that limped between the sheds. The dog wagged only half its tail. George scratched behind its ear and spoke low, not in words Lena could hear, but with the tone one uses for old friends and wounded creatures. That night, she lay on her bunk in a converted drawing room with 5 other women. The wallpaper had once been green. Now it peeled like birch bark. But the mattress was dry. The blanket smelled of lye and wool. She stared at the ceiling and listened. No bombs. No boots pounding overhead. No radios. Only the quiet creak of the manor's bones. Only the whistle of wind through old windows. And somewhere beyond the wall, faint, the sound of an axe splitting wood. Steady. Measured. She imagined George out there, hat tilted back, watching frost rise from the fields like smoke from a quiet fire. She didn't know his story. Didn't know where he'd fought, if he had at all, or whether he'd lost family. But she knew this. When he looked at her, he didn't see a German. He saw a girl with cold hands, learning to hold an axe. He saw a worker, a soul. In that silence, Lena closed her eyes. And for the first time in weeks, she did not dream of barbed wire or marching feet. She dreamt of a wood fire, of a fence without guards, of a terrier licking frost from a man's hand. The snow came early to North Yorkshire that year. By the end of November, the hedgerows were draped in white, and the manor's fields shimmered beneath thin sunlight. The prisoners, women and a few older men, were put to work clearing paths and gathering frozen turnips from the soil. It was back-breaking labor. But Lena didn't mind it. There was something almost sacred in the rhythm. Bend, lift, breathe. No shouting, no slogans. Just the muffled crunch of snow and the distant whistle of the wind. She worked in silence, her wool coat heavy with frost. Every so often she'd see George by the woodpile near the barn, axe flashing in the pale light, his pipe clenched in his teeth. The terrier followed him everywhere, its tail cutting small arcs in the air like a metronome of trust. At midday, the guards allowed the prisoners to rest near the barn. They were given tea, thin, barely sweet, and thick slices of brown bread baked in the manor kitchen. Lena had never tasted bread like it. Coarse, dark, with grains that clung to the teeth. But it filled her belly, and warmth began to return to her fingers. 2 guards stood nearby, smoking and talking quietly. They didn't seem to notice the prisoners listening. One of them, a younger man with red hair and the swagger of someone who had seen too much too early, was reading from a folded newspaper. Lena couldn't understand every word, but she caught fragments. Camps, liberated, Polish, the photos. Bloody hell, you should have seen them. The other guard spat in the snow. "Propaganda," he muttered. "Just like what they say about us. No, this is real. The Yanks found it. Place called Majdanek. Piles of shoes, hair, bones. Not just soldiers. Women. Kids." Lena froze. The words sounded absurd. Impossible. She turned to the woman beside her, a nurse from Bremen named Marta, and whispered in German, "Sie lügen." "They lie." Marta didn't answer. She just stared at her bread. Lena felt heat rise behind her eyes. The guards were lying. They had to be. The Reich had enemies everywhere, twisting stories to make Germany look like a beast. That's what they'd always said. That's what the radio announcers swore, their voices iron calm and certain. The young guard continued. And there's photos. The London papers'll print them soon. Skeletons in uniforms, a whole train of them. Lena stood abruptly, fists tightening around the crust of bread. She wanted to shout, to tell them they were liars, that Germany was fighting to save Europe, to protect civilization. But when she opened her mouth, no words came. She felt George watching her from the woodpile. He didn't say anything, didn't intervene. But his eyes, gray, quiet, rested on her with the weight of someone who'd already seen too much truth to argue. That night, back inside the manor dormitory, Lena sat awake long after lights out. The words circled in her head like cold birds. Shoes, hair, bones. She thought of her younger sister, Clara, who had vanished into the Eastern Registry 2 years ago. The officials had said she was working in a resettlement program. That was the word they used. Umsiedlung, resettlement, a simple word, clean, bureaucratic. But suddenly Lena wasn't so sure. The next morning, George called her to help fetch wood from a shed behind the stables. Inside, the air smelled of sap and iron. Sawdust coated the floor like dust on forgotten bones. He handed her a saw and motioned to the logs stacked against the wall. They worked in silence for nearly an hour. Then, without warning, George reached into his coat and pulled out a folded scrap of newspaper. He hesitated, as though deciding whether mercy meant speaking or staying silent. Finally, he set it on the workbench. "Read that if you can," he said softly. "It's from London, 2 days old." Lena didn't want to. She didn't want to see, but she did. The photo was grainy, black and white, printed beneath a headline she couldn't fully translate. The image itself needed no words. A row of corpses laid on the ground, their limbs thin as reeds. Behind them, a man in a British uniform covering his mouth. The caption, simple, clinical, mentioned Majdanek. Her hand trembled. "It's not true," she whispered. "It can't be." George's voice was low. "I wish it weren't." Lena stared at the image until it blurred. The wood shop grew smaller, colder. Her stomach twisted. For a moment she wanted to tear the photo, to throw it into the stove, to burn the lie before it could enter her bones. But she couldn't, because somewhere deep inside her, beyond loyalty, beyond fear, something whispered that she had known all along. That every rumor she dismissed, every disappearance, every convoy that left and never came back, had always pointed here. She sank onto a stool, breath shallow, eyes fixed on the page. George said nothing. He simply walked to the stove, lit his pipe, and waited beside her in the silence. Outside, the wind rose across the moor, carrying with it the brittle cry of crows. Lena looked down at her hands. The same hands that had turned dials, sent codes, relayed messages that guided bombers over cities. She had told herself she was only a technician, that she bore no blood. But in that dim shed, the weight of every transmitted word returned to her like ash. When she finally spoke, her voice cracked like ice on water. "Why would you show me this?" George exhaled, smoke curling like a ghost between them. "Because truth's kinder than lies, even when it hurts." Lena's throat tightened. She pressed the newspaper to her chest as if to crush the image out of existence. But the photograph had already branded itself into her memory. When she stepped outside, snow was falling again. Slow, deliberate flakes that covered everything without judgment. The air smelled of coal smoke and wet bark. Somewhere in the distance, church bells tolled from Harrogate, Their sound carried over the hills like a prayer for the dead. Lena stood in the open, face tilted to the gray sky, and felt the snow settle on her lashes. For the first time since the war began, she did not know what side she was on. The kitchen was nearly empty when she returned. The day's light was fading, and smoke curled up from the hearth, slow and amber. The old woman had left a pot of barley stew on the stove, covered with a folded towel to keep it warm. No one stirred. The house had settled into its evening hush, a hush that felt like winter breathing. Lena sat on the bench nearest the fire, her hands still red from the cold, her boots dripping quietly on the flagstone floor. She didn't eat, she didn't remove her coat. She just stared at the flames. The photos still burned behind her eyes. The bodies, the bones, the silence of the man standing in uniform with his hand over his mouth. She remembered how easily the radio had blocked it out. The language of war, logistics, targets, coordination. She had spoken those words fluently. She had signed them into the air like spells, and now she couldn't take them back. The kitchen door creaked. George stepped in, the terrier padding behind him, tail low. He saw her, nodded once, and walked past her without a word. He hung his coat by the back hook, removed his hat, and knelt to stoke the fire. Lena watched him in silence. The crackle of burning pine filled the room. She opened her mouth, closed it, tried again. "I sent them," she whispered. George didn't turn. "I sent the codes," she said again, louder. Her voice didn't shake this time. "I was in Signals Corps. They gave me coordinates. I relayed them, every morning, every night, day after day." George placed another log on the flames. "I didn't know what they meant, at first. Then I did, and I kept doing it." The terrier hopped onto the bench beside her, curling into the warmth of her side. Lena didn't move. I told myself I was just a technician, a cog, that someone else pushed the button, dropped the bomb, lit the ovens. But I was part of it, wasn't I? She turned toward George, eyes shining with firelight. "Wasn't I?" He looked up, pipe between his fingers. He didn't speak, just looked at her. Not with judgment, but with a stillness that said, "I hear you. I see you." Lena exhaled, sharp and slow, as though letting go of something long buried. "I believed everything," she said. "Everything they taught us. That we were the strong, the civilized, the chosen. I memorized speeches. I read their leaflets. I laughed at the jokes, even when they turned cruel." She looked back at the fire. "I remember one boy," she said quietly. "He was from Prague, a conscript. He'd been caught crying during roll call. They made us watch while the officers cut his boots in half and forced him to march in snow. We laughed, all of us. I laughed." The words sat heavy in the kitchen. George sat down across from her, pipe resting on the edge of the table. The flames hissed as resin boiled off the log. "I don't want forgiveness," Lena said. "I just want to stop carrying it. I don't know how." George finally spoke. "You don't stop carrying it. You carry it different." She blinked. He leaned forward, elbows on knees, voice as low as the wind in dry leaves. "We all carry something. Me, I've got a brother buried in Italy. He stepped on a mine clearing a farmhouse for refugees. I carry that." Lena lowered her gaze. "But I don't carry hate," he continued. "Not anymore. It burns too hot and it leaves nothing but ash. You carry memory. You carry sorrow. You carry the dead. But not hate." The fire popped. The terrier shifted in sleep. "You were lied to," he said. "So were we. War makes liars of everyone. But truth doesn't vanish just because someone covered it in a flag." Lena touched her sleeve. Her voice was barely breath now. "I didn't know how to feel before. I thought silence was strength. Now I can't stand it." George nodded. "Then break it." He stood slowly, as if the conversation had ended not with a verdict, but with a door quietly left ajar. He ladled stew into a bowl, set it before her, and added a thick slice of brown bread beside it. No sermon, no absolution. Just food, just fire. She stared at it. This humble act of grace. She couldn't remember the last time someone had offered her something without asking for loyalty in return. George pulled his coat back on, tipped his hat once. "I'll be in the barn," he said. He left. Lena sat alone, the bowl warming her fingers. She tore the bread slowly, piece by piece, dipping it into the stew. Each bite grounded her. Each mouthful reminded her that this was real. Not a broadcast, not a slogan, not an order over radio static. But warmth, silence, a man who had every reason to hate her. And didn't. Outside, the snow deepened. Inside, the fire held steady, and for the first time, Lena wept. Not from fear, not from grief, but from the ache of being seen and not condemned. She would remember this night for the rest of her life, not as the moment she confessed, but as the moment someone listened. The snow had crusted hard by the second week of December. It crackled under boots, clung to low branches, made ghosts of fences and barrows. The camp moved slower in the cold. Even the guards spoke less. The world had quieted itself, as if waiting for some unspoken moment to pass. Lena had taken to waking before the bell. She would dress in the dark, wrap her scarf twice, and slip down the back stair toward the barn, where George had left a bench near the hayloft and a chipped enamel kettle that never seemed to be empty. He never asked her to come, never waited. But somehow, he always arrived 10 minutes later, pipe already lit, with a tin of biscuits under one arm. They would sit in silence as the sun tried to rise behind the clouds. The terrier would curl beneath the bench. The frost on the barn's roof would weep in slow rivulets by mid-morning. And each time Lena would have her notebook, a small thing, its cover torn and corners curled, where she wrote letters she never sent. To Clara, her sister, the girl who had once tied ribbons around Lena's braids before school and fed the neighbor's geese behind the bakery. The girl whose name had appeared on the resettlement lists. The girl Lena had stopped asking about because no one ever answered. Now she wrote to her, "Dear Clara, today I saw a man feed a crippled dog and then hand me a biscuit without a word. I don't understand the world anymore. But I think maybe that's a beginning." Some days the letters were short, just observations. A detail from the kitchen, the shape of the frost on the window pane, the sound of boots on wet stone. Other days they spilled across the page like thawed rivers. George showed me how to split firewood without bruising the grain. He says the blade doesn't need to be angry, just precise. It made me think of the way you used to slice apples, always turning the peel into one long ribbon. She never signed them, never folded them, just wrote, line after line, in pencil. She kept them beneath her mattress. The guards never searched her things. Not anymore. She had stopped being a threat the moment she stopped shouting back. But what surprised her most weren't the letters. It was the crows. They gathered at the fence each morning, near the back shed where the compost was tossed. 3, sometimes 5, glossy black against the white field. They didn't caw much, just watched. One had a white streak on its left wing. Another limped. Lena began to notice their patterns, how they arrived before the sun cleared the trees, how they tilted their heads as if listening when she passed. One morning, she brought a crust of bread from the kitchen. She knelt by the fence, tossed it gently. The birds hopped forward, cautious. One pecked, the others followed, and then they stayed. Each morning after, Lena found them waiting. It became a ritual. Bread, a whisper, a moment. She began writing about them to Clara. The crows don't ask questions. They just arrive. They remind me of you. Clever, quiet, watching when no one thought you noticed. One day, George caught her kneeling at the fence, palm outstretched with crumbs. He didn't interrupt, just watched from a distance, arms folded, pipe unlit. Later, as they walked back toward the manor, he said, "My mother used to say crows carry messages for the dead." Lena looked at him. "Not bad ones," he added, "just messages." Lena nodded once slowly. "I've been writing them," she said. "Letters to my sister. She's not dead. But I think the world she was in is." George didn't answer for a long time. Then he said, "Maybe the crows will get them to her anyway." She didn't smile. But something inside her unnodded. That night, she folded one of the letters. Just one. She walked to the window, opened it to the frost, and set the folded paper on the sill. In the morning, it was gone. No footprints, no wind, just gone. She never told anyone, not even George. But each week after, she left another. Each time, the letter disappeared, and each time, the crows returned. Some might call it superstition, others, grief. But to Lena, it became something else. A quiet contract, a way of saying, "I remember you. I'm still here. I'm not the same." In a world where orders had been shouted through wires, and people had disappeared without farewells, this small act of writing what could not be said aloud was its own kind of defiance. One without flags, one without chains, just words, just crows, just snow falling on a roof as two former enemies shared tea without speaking, and a prisoner began to live again, sentence by sentence, breath by breath. Christmas came to Camp 186 in a way no one expected. There were no hymns broadcast over loudspeakers, no trees in the courtyard, no speeches or parades. Just frost so thick it turned every hedgerow into lace, and the low sun bleeding pale gold through the mist. December 24th. The morning bell didn't ring. At first, Lena thought it had broken. She rose before light as always, wrapped her scarf twice, and stepped down into the silent corridor. The kitchen was already warm. The old woman, Mrs. Edna, she'd finally learned, was at the stove in her holiday apron, humming a tune Lena did not recognize. Something soft and circular, like wind blowing through reeds. A kettle whistled low behind her. The terrier was curled on a sack of potatoes, one ear twitching. Mrs. Edna looked up. "No duties today," she said. "Go on and sit, it's Christmas." Lena froze in the doorway. Christmas. She hadn't marked the calendar. She hadn't dared. Christmas belonged to another world, a world with cathedrals, butter cookies, wax candles, and Clara singing off-key in their grandmother's parlor. But here, in this red brick manor-turned camp, it had returned. Quietly. Without permission, she sat at the table. Mrs. Edna poured tea and handed her a slice of bread with dried currants and cinnamon. "No rations pulled for it?" she said with a wink. "I kept these back from October. Thought we'd need them." Lena took the slice in both hands. Warmth spread into her palms like memory. George arrived a half-hour later, trailing snow and wood smoke. He had combed his hair, which made him look younger and more tired at once. In one hand, he carried a paper-wrapped package the size of a shoebox. He nodded to Lena, then to Mrs. Edna, and set the box on the table. "Hope it's still good," he said. The old woman unwrapped it. A round of cheddar, wrapped in wax paper, and a small jar of something dark. "Chutney," George added. "Traded for it with the grocer in Ripley. Gave him one of my good pipes." Mrs. Edna chuckled. "The fancy one with the carved horse?" George shrugged. Never smoked it anyway. Lena watched them, unsure whether to speak, unsure if she belonged in that warmth. George looked at her. "No chores today," he said. "I can still help," Lena said quietly. "You already are." He handed her a knife. Together, they cut the cheese into wedges and laid them beside the currant bread. The terrier sneezed in approval. Outside, the wind rose, not cruel, just insistent. And then came the sound, singing, faint at first, from beyond the courtyard. Voices, untrained, uneven, rising through the morning frost. German voices. Lena stood. She walked to the window. Across the yard, near the old stables, a group of women had gathered in coats and scarves. Marta was among them. So was the red-haired girl from Dresden, who rarely spoke. They stood in a loose circle, their boots packed into the snow, their breath visible as they sang. Stille Nacht, Heilige Nacht, Silent Night, Holy Night. The melody hovered above the camp like smoke. It was not loud, it was not rehearsed, it was human. A hymn for no one, a lullaby for the dead, a song that asked nothing and gave no answers. Lena felt her throat tighten. George stepped beside her. He didn't interrupt. When the second verse began, she opened the door. The wind caught the song and scattered it across the fields. She stepped outside. Snow fell lightly, soft flakes, slow as feathers. The ground didn't crunch beneath her boots. It gave. She walked toward the circle. No one stopped her. No one asked where she'd come from. The women parted as she arrived. Marta made space. Lena joined them. The third verse began. Not everyone knew the words, but they hummed. She hummed. Tears welled in her eyes, not for herself, but for the girl she had been 2 years ago, holding Clara's hand, laughing at the wrong jokes, believing the wrong things. That girl had not been evil, just asleep. Now, in a prisoner's coat, beside strangers who had once called themselves proud soldiers, she sang with a voice she barely recognized. At the edge of the circle, Lena spotted a figure, George, leaning on the fence post, hat tipped low, pipe unlit. Watching, not as a guard, not as a victor, but as a witness. And beside him, the crows, 3 of them, perched on the wire. Listening, Lena closed her eyes. She didn't pray. She didn't believe, not in the way she used to, but she gave thanks. For bread, for warmth, for songs sung without flags, for a Christmas without chains. The snow didn't melt after Christmas. Instead, it deepened, quietly, like a memory no one dared disturb. By early January, the trees stood brittle and bare, their branches etched against gray sky like ink on paper. The wind returned to the camp in long, tired sighs, not cruel, but constant. Even the crows began to roost longer, as if waiting for something. That morning, the sound of a motorcycle broke the quiet. It came just after dawn, tires grinding frost, engine coughing at the gate. Lena heard it from the back shed, where she'd gone early to sweep the floor and stoke the barn stove. She stood still, broom in hand, as the engine died and the quiet returned. Heavier this time. Not just winter silence. A silence that listens before it speaks. By midday, the whole camp had shifted. People moved slower. Guards murmured instead of whistling. And George, who always came by to check the firewood, to share a biscuit or refill his pipe, didn't come at all. Lena found him that afternoon by the ash tree. The tree stood alone behind the barn. Old, with bark flaking like parchment and roots that rose out of the earth like knuckles of some buried giant. In autumn, it dropped seeds in spinning silence. Now, it stood stripped, a skeleton of a thing, black against the snow. George sat on the bench beneath it, coat wrapped tight, hat in his hands. Not smoking, not moving. In his lap, unfolded like a wound, was a telegram. Lena approached quietly. He didn't look up. She sat beside him, not asking, just waiting. The paper trembled slightly in his hands. He passed it to her wordlessly. Her English was still clumsy, but the words were few. Lieutenant Thomas William Hargreaves, killed in action. Ardennes, Front 28th. December 1944. She read it twice, then once more. George didn't speak. His face was still but not blank. It held the slow wear of someone who had expected this day for years, and still bled when it came. Lena folded the telegram and returned it to his hands. "I'm sorry," she whispered. George nodded, slow and long, like a tree bowing to a storm. They sat like that for a while. The wind touched the edges of the bench. Then he spoke. Tom was the clever one. Joined the signals first, not because of duty. He just liked puzzles. When war came, he didn't hesitate. His voice was low. Each word dug into the frozen earth between them. He wrote from Normandy. Said the land smelled like old wood and sweat. Said he was learning German from a prisoner who played the violin. George smiled barely. Last letter came in October. Said he missed the snow. Said he missed the ash tree. He placed a hand gently on the rough bark beside him. Mother planted this the day he was born. Said ash trees could see beyond men, that they remember things we forget. Lena looked at the branches, bare and reaching. The sky behind them was the color of pewter. She thought of the crows, of the way they watched without judgment. She didn't ask what George would do next, because war doesn't answer, it only takes. And when it's done taking, it leaves people behind, holding scraps of paper under trees that no longer bloom. She reached into her coat pocket, pulled out her notebook, opened to the last letter she'd written. To Clara. She tore the page carefully, the sound crisp like footsteps on snow, and folded it once, then again. She placed it gently on the bench between them. George looked at it, then looked at her. She nodded once. He understood. Some things are too large to carry alone. He picked up the letter and tucked it into the inner pocket of his coat. Maybe Tom can carry this one, he said. The ash tree creaked softly behind them. They sat beneath it for a long time. Two people bound not by nation or uniform, but by grief, by the unbearable task of remembering, by the strange grace of having someone else still alive to remember with. Before they rose, George placed a hand on the tree's trunk. Tell him, he said softly. Tell him I waited. The wind stirred the branches overhead, and though no reply came, Lena felt something settle. Not peace, but place. As if sorrow had been given a seat at the table and no longer needed to knock. They walked back toward the manor in silence. The crows followed overhead. That evening, Lena didn't go to the kitchen. She went to her bunk, lit the candle low, and wrote one more letter. This one she addressed not to Clara, but to George. She didn't sign it, but at the bottom, she drew a single ash leaf. The next morning, when she went to the tree, she found a folded note on the bench. 3 words. Still listening, always. The chains returned on a Wednesday. The sky had cleared that morning. A thin, brittle blue, like porcelain. The frost on the hedgerows had begun to loosen, and the crows circled lazily in the high air, as if winter had finally begun to yawn and stretch. But something was different. Lena sensed it the moment she stepped into the courtyard. The guard stood stiffer. A black Humber staff car sat near the front gate, engine idling, its fenders crusted with dried mud from the southern roads. Inside the manor, boots clattered sharply on tile. New voices echoed, sharper, clipped, the rhythm of men used to barking commands, not receiving them. A new officer had arrived, Major Alan Grigsby. From Dover HQ. Clipboard in hand, cap pressed crisp as a blade, with 2 silver pips on his epaulets and a face that looked carved from chalk. Inspection tour, they said, temporary oversight. But the atmosphere had already changed. The kindling that Lena and George split in the barn suddenly had to be logged and weighed. The bread slices rationed to the gram. Guards were told to walk with their rifles visible, safety off. Doors locked, uniform codes enforced, movement strictly timed. And then the order came. Detail 5, kitchen waste disposal, would now require wrist restraints. For security, the major said. Standard regulation for high-risk Axis personnel. Lena, assigned to Detail 5 that week, stared at the chain in the corporal's hands. It was shorter than she remembered. Cleaner. Oiled. The cuffs still held the old army stamp, dated 1939. She said nothing, but her throat felt dry. The corporal approached. Not cruel, not apologetic, just following the paper in his hand. Hold out your wrists. The others watched. The kitchen staff, the women on potato peeling, Marta frozen at the doorway. Lena looked around once, then slowly extended her arms. The metal touched her skin, and time folded. For a moment, she was back in France. The lorry rattling, the boots, the shouting, the shame that came not from guilt, but from not knowing why they hated her. The clink of the cuffs closing echoed in the hall, and then came the voice. No, it wasn't loud, but it landed like a dropped hammer. All eyes turned. George stood near the rear door, his hat in one hand, axe in the other. His boots were still damp with snow from the morning rounds. He stepped forward. Major Grigsby turned. "Civilian staff are to remain outside processing areas, sir." George ignored him. He looked at the corporal. "Take them off." The corporal froze. "Excuse me?" Grigsby barked. George turned slowly. His voice never rose. "These women aren't high risk. They've been here for months without incident. And this one," he nodded at Lena, "has done more for the kitchens and woodpile than half your green lads with rifles." "That's not the point," Grigsby snapped. "Regulation is regulation. The war isn't over." George stepped closer, the axe still in his hand, lowered, not threatening, but not forgotten. "And humanity isn't regulation," he said. A long pause. Grigsby's lips tightened. "You're a groundsman, not a captain." "I know," George replied. "That's why I still know what people look like." Lena stood frozen. The chain dug into her skin. Not from pain, but from memory. Grigsby gestured to the corporal. "Do your duty." But the corporal hesitated. Behind him, Mrs. Edna stepped forward. Her voice, when it came, was steady as granite. "She brings us bread every morning, tends the fire. She hasn't raised her voice in weeks." "You think a chain will fix something?" More staff emerged. A young kitchen boy, an elderly driver, one of the medical volunteers. No one shouted. No one blocked the way. They simply stood there, present. Grigsby turned red, then pale, then silent. Finally, with a curt wave, he muttered, "Fine, but it's your liability." He stormed out. The staff car peeled away a few minutes later. Its tires spat gravel at the gate, and Lena, still cuffed, stood in the cold. George walked over. Wordlessly, he reached into his pocket, pulled out a key, and unlocked the shackles. They fell to the floor like dead leaves. He didn't speak. He just handed her a cloth to warm her wrists. Lena took it slowly. Behind them, the wind stirred. One of the crows landed on the fence post and let out a single caw. Then silence again. But this silence didn't cut. It held. She looked at George, hands trembling. "You could have been dismissed." He shrugged, not for the first time. She folded the cloth tighter, holding it like something sacred. "Why did you do it?" He looked out over the field, where the frost was breaking and small patches of earth had begun to show. "Because some chains," he said, "don't belong on people anymore." She nodded once, not in gratitude, but in understanding. Something had broken in the camp that day, but it wasn't discipline. It was distance. And in its place, something older began to grow. Not peace, not yet, but soil soft enough to plant it. The war was still raging far to the east, but the days at Camp 186 began to change. By late March, the snow was gone. Grass returned, thin and cautious, like a child learning to walk again. The fields turned soft underfoot. The crows stayed longer each morning, and one by one, the names on the prisoner logs began to vanish. Transfers, releases, repatriations. No fanfare, no trumpets, just typed lists, signed forms, and boots on roads heading south. On a gray Thursday, Lena's name appeared. She didn't believe it at first. The guard at the mess handed her a folded slip. Typed, stamped, cleared by the War Office. Return authorized pending final transport. She read it 3 times. The words refused to settle. She had not asked to leave, had not imagined it. Camp 186 had become, somehow, a place outside the war. a stillness between two collapsing worlds. To leave it now felt like tearing a page from a story not yet finished. She packed in silence. There wasn't much. The civilian dress, a scarf, her notebook, now filled cover to cover with letters never sent and things she couldn't say aloud. And the last thing, a small carved button, shaped like an ash leaf. She hadn't carved it. George had. She'd found it one morning on the bench under the ash tree. No note, just the button, smooth and sanded, placed gently where they used to sit. She kept it in her pocket. That morning, the manor was unusually quiet. Mrs. Edna hugged her, once, tight and brief, and pressed a biscuit into her hand. "For the road," she said. Lena smiled. Marta waved from the far end of the courtyard, her eyes damp. No words passed between them. None were needed. The truck idled near the gate. A corporal checked her papers, gestured to the bed of the vehicle. Lena turned once. George stood beneath the ash tree. He didn't wave, didn't move. Just stood, hat in his hand, looking at her the way someone looks at the edge of a forest, as if it might swallow the memory of you. She walked toward him. Each step felt heavier than the last. When she reached him, she held out her hand. He looked at it, then pulled her into an embrace instead. Rough arms, warm coat, a smell of wood smoke and wet earth. It lasted no more than 3 seconds, but it reached deeper than years. When they pulled apart, she placed the button into his hand. He looked down at it, surprised, and smiled. "Figured you'd keep it," he said. "I am," she said, "just sharing it." He closed his fingers over it, and then she did the thing she had never done since arriving. The thing she hadn't even dared at Christmas. She took his hand and pressed it to her chest, right over her heart, so he would know. Then she turned, climbed into the back of the truck, and didn't look back. The engine coughed once, then rolled forward. As the gate passed her, she saw the ash tree sway in the breeze, its first tiny buds just beginning to appear. She let the wind touch her face. She didn't cry, not because she wasn't sad, but because what had been broken had also been rebuilt. Not into what was before, but something else entirely, something quiet, something enduring. In the weeks that followed, she would cross checkpoints, hand over forms, answer questions. She would be handed her old name again, her country, her shame. But when she was alone, and the air smelled of wood smoke or frost, she would close her eyes and return to the firelight of a manor kitchen, a crow's shadow on the wall, and a man who removed her chains without asking why. Years later, she would write her story down, not as a confession, not as a defense, but as a remembering of what it meant to be unmade and what it meant to be rehumanized, not by courts or politics or nations, but by a man with an axe, a dog with a limp, and a tree that had been waiting for spring. And in the final page of that account, in a small script near the margin, she would write just one line: "He taught me silence could heal. He made room for me inside it, and I stayed, not in body, but in roots,